יתגדל ויתקדש שמר רבה, בעולמה דברה חירותה, וימליך מלכותה, ויצמח פורקנה, ויקרב משיחה, בחייכון וביומכון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ויאמרו אמן.
I'd like to introduce you to this exhibition that I put together for Holocaust Memorial Day 2020. It's a very special day this year because it's also the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and that's where my grandfather was murdered in 1942. So the exhibition starts here, where you can see we've put together, it's based on a lot of documents. Many of them are in French, but there are translations. And I've tried to tell his story in very simple terms so that I can explain it to all ages. So he originally came from Poland, and in fact his hometown was very near to a place called Auschwitz, which the Nazis later changed the name to Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is where the family used to go for picnics on a Sunday. But things were very difficult for Jewish families in Poland at that time, and in 1928 already they had to flee, and they fled to Belgium. Things then started to become, my father had a few normal years and went to school there in Belgium, but then, as I say here, in 1942, in 1940 originally, they had to flee again from Belgium. And they went in the direction of southwest France because that was an area that was called Vichy France at that time. There was no actual German control, but and they were under the impression that they would be safe there. They were, unbeknownst to them, of course, a large number of the population were only too happy to help the German force. So they arrived in Marmande. I don't know the exact details of how long they were there before he was arrested, not many hours or even perhaps a night. And he was arrested and taken to a little salon in the town with about 9 or 10 other people. And from there he was taken to a holding camp a few miles away. I won't go over all the detail because there's a lot of it, but what I've tried to do, that the Holocaust is a very dark and huge topics, and if I want to communicate with people and to keep telling this story in order to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again, then I thought the best way was to focus on one person's life, because then people could perhaps identify it could be your grandfather, could be your father, it could be any one of you. We just don't know when these things will erupt. So here I've told you, here's the plaque on the wall of the camp he was first taken to. This is called Cassenoy in the Lot-et-Garonne region of France. There's a photo of some people arriving at Cassenoy. It's not him. And then on the other side here, there have been some people who did a lot of research on what happened to the Jews in that area. A man called Alexandre Duluth, and he wrote a book about this, and we got a lot of information from him, and we met with him there in 2012. And he is not a Jewish person. He felt that what he had to do, he wished he hadn't had to have written this book, but he felt that he did have to write it because it was their local history and everybody should know, local people should know what happened. And you have here an amazing document. It's from the mayor of this town, Marmande, who writes to his Gestapo bosses, "I have the honour to inform you that in accordance with your instructions, the gathering of the Jewish in Marmande has been performed this morning. The operation was carried out under my direction," etc. So he was more than happy to do what he was bade to do. And thank God there was a doctor somewhere on the scene there, and he stopped my grandmother from being pulled into this truck because he said she had to go into hospital. and also her daughter, my aunt, because she was pregnant. My aunt's husband was put on the truck, but he managed somehow to jump off the truck. So the person who didn't get away was my grandfather. Here you can see the images just to give you an idea of the family. This, of course, is Leib Nussabum that we're speaking of, my grandfather. This is his wife, my grandmother, who did survive the war, and her daughter Laura, and that's my father, who carried the death of his father, the murder of his father, I should say, with him the whole of his life. Here I've given you some indication of the whole German system of categorizing Jews in a way that they would try to make them in some sense subhuman. But you can also see this in the genocides in Rwanda and Darfur, where people give people enough names and enough ways to be identified, and then they can be attacked more easily. I think in Rwanda they talked about people being locusts and so on. And this, everybody had, in Poland, this was since 1939, the introduction of a badge. Put somebody in the street with a yellow badge on and everybody can kick them. And then Jewish businesses had to be marked so everybody could smash the windows. And that's the way you get the population to do the job of the invading army. Here you'll see from the Cassinoy, from the camp in Cassinoy, he was sent by train to a camp called Drancy. That's just on the outskirts of Paris. There's two images here. It was built for 700 detainees, but sometimes held more than 7,000. And it was a holding camp. And from there they went into cattle trucks, sliding doors, cattle trucks, with no windows, a tiny bit of ventilation at the top. And from there they went from Drancy eventually to Auschwitz. And they went on convoys of 1,000 people on the convoy. And his convoy was convoy number 30. And on the 9th of September 1942, and very few of them were selected. 23 men and 68 women were selected for work on arrival. He got out of that train. It's 1,500 kilometers, approximately 900 miles from Drancy, from Paris, right across Europe into Poland, back where he had come from originally, with no food, no water, 4 or 5 days in a train. And I think of him sometimes. I've read many reports of people saying that some people weren't even lucid by the time they arrived. But he got out, and it must have been the fresh air that hit him straight away from the stench of the cattle truck. Got out, smelt the fresh air, and was gassed on arrival, together with 908 people of the 1,000 people on the convoy. And that is what they did. There were thousands and thousands of these convoys, each time with 1,000 people on them. Here you can see his name on the convoy. The fact that they list him as being Austrian, because that bit of land there sometimes was Poland, sometimes was Austrian, and that's his date of birth. And I think this Charlotte Debo, who says, yes, obviously they expected the worst, but nobody imagined the horrors. Here you will see that he left on convoy number 30 from Drancy to Auschwitz, 1,000 people. 909 were gassed on arrival, 11 were selected 11 men and 68 women. I could have had a series of photos here that would have been so shocking that probably nobody would have stopped to look at them. I've already met people that I know who say, oh, I don't really want to go, I've seen all that, I don't want to see it, you know. Here you've got an image of 43,000. Has anybody here been to Auschwitz?
Not Auschwitz, I've been to one of the camps.
You've been to a camp, yes. But in Auschwitz they have a lot of, here there were about 43,000 pairs of shoes. So they could be our shoes, your shoes, his shoes, anybody's shoes. And then I started thinking about today, and so I've written here, yesterday shoes found in Auschwitz, where you can see for yourself. Today it's the life jackets on the beaches in Italy and southern Greece. And what will it be tomorrow? Well, this is something that the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which is extremely important body of people in London who work tirelessly to organise this every year. It's always on the 27th of January because that's the day that Auschwitz was liberated. And they do a lot of outreach to children. And here we were lucky enough to have Sue Alwyn, the Club Cool, who came, and they weren't directed, and they drew these beautiful drawings here. And there was actually a competition that they organised, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. So they had things that came from all over the country, other parts of Wales too, where children sent in their drawings of the memorial flame and chose winners. If you go to their website, it's absolutely packed with information.
Because it's a very sad story, but does people remembering, does that help you to feel better?
I'm not sure about feeling better. I think it's I think duty is not a word people use very often now, is it? But I think it's our duty to keep saying the names. And I have another thing in my Twitter feed where I get a photo every day of a person who was murdered in Auschwitz and some biographical details of them. And there are a few other people in Aberystwyth I've met who received that information. And unless you keep saying their names, then it's very easy, isn't it, to sweep it under the carpet. This is the famous gates to Auschwitz. Of course, I'll make cry, going to tell people that the work would make you free. That they might be going to get work there. And here, we had to put this here, but this jumps ahead a little bit. It's based on information that we actually got in 2014, and we got original documents here where they took my father's suitcase and everybody else there and told them to leave it there, it will follow you on up to Paris. Well, of course they didn't follow on up to Paris, and then they put a notice saying that if you would like to, any relatives of the people who have these suitcases, feel free to come and collect them. Well, that was a kind of a nonsense because all those people were in hiding, obviously. So they emptied all the suitcases, they held a public auction, and they sold everything. And there's records of what he had in his case. He had a bottle of wine, 2 tins of sardines, a packet of tea, a razor, berets, 3 shirts. And I don't know what happened here. I don't know if my grandmother packed this for him, or whether at the last minute, whether he still had that case coming from Belgium. I don't know, but I do know that this is what was in his suitcase. And that they sold it. So not only can you actually murder people, you can then take their possessions and you can make money out of them. And that's the one thing that I do say very loudly about the Holocaust. It's the first mass murder and attempted genocide on an industrial profit-making scale. There are big German companies, Siemens, IG Farben, but actually there's the company that built Auschwitz, there's the company that developed Zyklon B gas that they used to murder the people with, And then, of course, they used them as slave labour. So it was also a money-making activity. And I don't like to shock people, but on the other hand, I do have to say it, is that when my father did see the proof of it written down, because we knew and we didn't know, but when we first saw it, Leib Nussabum date and the Gaston arrival that I've just shown you over there, he wanted to put an advert in the most international paper that he could think of, which would be the New York Herald Tribune. And he wanted to offer $10,000 reward for the bar of soap that had been made of his father's body. Well, this was very harrowing at the time, and we guided him away from that, really, and he ended up putting a memorial in the newspaper. As I've gotten older myself, I think, well, he should have just tried to get it in the paper, quite honestly. I mean, they did make lampshades, and they did make soap. And you have to come to terms with the fact, you know, as I say, I was born in 1945, and in 1944 still, and 1945 still, that is what was happening. That is the reality. And I can see, sometimes I fantasize that I'll go here and I'll find this man, Joe Molly, who bought my grandfather's suitcase for 18 francs.
Do you think that Del Molly knew?
Oh, yes, they was advertised, belongings of the Jews.
Gee.
Yes. And they had to pay tax on it as well.
They had to pay tax, and somebody typed up the list. Somebody
Yes,
was there, there was a clerk.
This is the original document. You can read it here in the French. Valise number, Nussbaum, Leib, 1 valise, 1 bouteille de vin, 1 botte, deux boîtes de sardines, 1 paquet de thé. It's all listed. That's the official documents.
Often when we hear about it as students, we hear the story of everybody, don't we? But because this is one person with one set of documents, it's so personal.
Yes.
It's one story.
Yes, and you can see here some of the other people. Here's somebody else here, and he had a lot of things in his case. And there are many, I've seen pages and pages and pages and pages of this. And
Have you guys got any questions there? Because Jackie's a fond of knowledge, not just about her family history, but also how she's selected. I mean, it's so beautifully put together. It tells such a story that really.
It's extraordinary to have it.
It's extraordinary.
But I was just about to say that, fortunate is not the word to use, but relative to some people who lost people in the Holocaust, we were quite fortunate because the further east you go into Lithuania and Russia and Hungary, you can't find all these records. And there, very often people were taken, whole villages, taken out into the woods, made to dig a huge pit, and then they were shot and put in there and covered up. And there's no records. And there could be 3 generations of the family in one pit. Gone, exactly. No descendants to ever remember their name or anything. So, in fact, the Holocaust deniers like to say that there weren't 6 million. As a matter of fact, there were far more than 6 million, but nobody knows. My cousin in Belgium, she writes that to me all the time. Nobody knows. They disappeared.
And as well, I think some of the camps destroyed records before.
Some did.
Right
Yes. This is this wonderful researcher Deleuze who found all this in France. The French situation is a bit more accessible than many places, but yes, they tried to blow up the ovens and the crematoria before they left, as the Red Army were advancing. But then this is my father. You saw him as a younger man over there. We went to Poland in 1988, and there he is standing in Auschwitz with this photograph here in his hand. If wherever he went in Poland, he showed this photograph. And somewhere on the road, we met, it was a long drive. We went afterwards from Warsaw down to Auschwitz. And at the same stop where we stopped, there was a bus full of Catholic priests. He couldn't control him. He went up and had anger and said, "Where were you? What did you do? What did you do when my father was being murdered? What did you do?" He wanted to know what the response of the church was.
Was there a response?
So there we are on the way there. This is my father. This is myself with my father in 1988. There he is at the ovens where they burnt the bodies after they were gassed in the gas chamber. There he is, walking into Auschwitz, 1988. Then, much later on, he at least had finally been able to say Kaddish, which is our prayer for the dead. So he had waited all those years before he could get there to say Kaddish for his father. He passed away in the late 90s, and in 2012, my brother and my nephew, who is a doctor in Paris, he was born in hiding actually during the war in southwest France, wanted to know how they survived and who helped them. As he says, they put out who helped this family. Two cousins from 1942 and 1945, who helped them? And they posted these old photos of my grandmother and the little child that was born there, which is now him. As he said, there were people who took risks for us. This is one of the reasons that we are keen to find witnesses. And he was born during the occupation, is now looking for those who sheltered him. So there were a lot of adverts went out everywhere. And in 2013, we went to the Holocaust Museum in Paris, and they have an amazing record. They have a screen which rotates all the time, so every single person who was deported from France appears on that screen. And you can obviously stop it to look for somebody specific you're looking for. So there's a picture of him that's on that screen. And this here you can see, these walls, they're just names. These are all the names of the Jews of France. There's a close-up of my grandfather's name. And
I was there at the weekend,
Oh,
but
were
it was
you?
closed, and I wanted to go in because of your exhibition.
Oh.
I went for a wedding, and on
Oh.
Friday we walked past and
yes,
and
it's an amazing
paid
place.
our respects.
Well worth a visit. And you see here what they did here. There was a street, it was called, I can't remember what it used to be called, but they changed it to the Allée des Justes. So it was to honour the righteous who helped the Jews. And then also I was able to see there, they put together for me the other people who were on convoy number 30. So all these people, there were 1,000 people in that convoy. I don't know who was in the truck with him, but at least I can, they're here, as you can see him there. We've only always had this one photo. Yes, young children. And you have to think, don't you? You think, well, who was standing next to him in the truck? Did they speak? Did he meet anybody from Antwerp, where he came from? Did he know anybody? You don't know. This I also saw on a wall nearby there, the school that they took, to the memory of the principal, staff and pupils of this school arrested in 1943 and 44 by the Vichy police and the Gestapo, deported and exterminated at Auschwitz because they were born Jewish. It's very difficult for us to always talk about this, because there has been a certain point recently when people, they don't want to hear anymore, they don't want to see anymore, and you feel a bit like the spectre at the feast. You know, you've always got this burden hanging, you feel as if it's, and that it's a difficult thing to explain, but I'm actually don't feel like that anymore. I feel the time has come to speak, partly because of what's happening in the world in general, because of the increase of racism everywhere, nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, black-white racism. It's really quite scary, and I think it urgently needs to be, education needs to really, you can do nothing better than try to educate children in such a way as they learn to regard people around them as all being human beings.
So being active helps in a way.
Yes.
That you're taking.
Yes. Well,
being proactive.
Yes, I wish my father could have seen this, you know. So I know I've done it for him as well as my grandfather.
Yeah.
This is a list of concentration camps. Most people are amazed at how many concentration camps there were. They only know the famous ones, Belsen-Sobibor, Auschwitz. But have a look there and you can see the number of people killed in each one. And this is the Zyklon B gas that was used. And if you go online, as I did, to look for images of Zyklon B, you can find the most awful things. Like I found T-shirts with smiley faces saying Zyklon B, and I found tins of peanuts in Zyklon B tins. I mean, that's the kind of world that we live in somewhere. I don't mean you and you and you, but that is the world that we live in. So it's not, you know, the soil is very... Anyway, to get on to more, to other things, in answer to this advert, who helped this family in 1942-45, this amazing lady came out of the woodwork 70 years later and sent this email that was written in the paper to say, I know that child, I remember that boy. I went to his second birthday and I remember it because there was a cake. And there were no cakes in the war, so that's how she remembered. And she then told, and we all went to, that's us all going to Bordeaux. We went to Bordeaux to meet her, and she told us the whole story. And then we knew that the lady who, this amazing lady, Lucienne Deguilhem, a French woman who had worked for the town hall in Marmande and had been asked to supply lists of Jews to the Nazis, 10 this week, 10 the next week, and then they wanted to take a transport of children. She just said no, 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 and no, and obviously was at risk of losing her job. And she lost her job, and nothing stopped her. She worked with the French resistance, and she hid people in her attics. She had about 5 Jewish families in her attics. They weren't there all the time, they could come out, but she knew from the French resistance when the raids were coming, and they would take a group of children into the woods for 3 or 4 days, and they just camped there. When you talk to, well, I'm rushing ahead here, but these people here are the survivors that she saved. And we got her managed to, it's a long process to get registered with the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, to get somebody registered as a righteous person. And so she became registered as righteous, and then the medal was given to her descendants on this wonderful day when we all went there. And all these people came from New York, from Belgium, from Israel, from Germany, from France, from Holland. And, well, it was very moving. They all told these stories. And some of those who had been children at the time said that she was so wonderful that when she took them out, or somebody, whoever, took them to the woods, they were more or less told they were going on a trip and a picnic. So they didn't panic. And they just went to the woods for a few days, and then they could come back later on. So that's the story of Lucienne, the moving, des mouvants retrouvailles, the moving memorial. 72 years later, she recalls, they used to live with his mother and his grandmother in a house in the village that Lucienne Deguilhem offered several Jewish families. She was the town clerk, and whenever she heard of a potential roundup, she would send the Jewish families to stay with other families. This is how little Jackie's family hid in my cousin's pharmacy. So he was born there, and there he is meeting a lady who knew him when he was 2. And then we tried to show you, it might be a little bit out of sequence here, but my grandfather's footsteps when he was first arrested, he was taken to this place here, so we walked to the door so that we knew we had walked. We knew we had seen what he saw, walked through this door, and that was the first holding camp. Only recently this year, by some amazing thing, we found these cards. A member of the family was moving house, and these were the last cards he wrote. They were written in Cassanois. They're not yet translated. they're a little bit strange because it's Yiddish, but it's not written in Hebrew characters, so we have to get that translated. This was the book where we first saw the names. This man, Klausfeld, he searched tirelessly. He devoted all his life to it, or he has done. He's still alive. And then my father, this was the cover of his book, and my father wrote here. He wrote in Yiddish, and then he wrote, "And these words which I command thee this day shall be engraven on thine heart from generation down generation into all eternity." Has anybody been to Yad Vashem in Israel? No, it's the most extraordinary experience. You know, they have a whole building just for the children. I mean, there were small children on these trains, sometimes totally unaccompanied by adults, 4, 5 and younger.
This isn't the end of the journey for you then, this exhibition, if things are still being translated.
Yes, this is the last thing I really want to know. I can read a little bit of it, the Liebe Kinder, to my darling children. And I've seen them, I've had these in my hands, but you know, this was about 3 weeks ago. So
And where are they kept?
they're in London, my brother's got them at the moment, so.
So how did he get them? How did he have them?
I think they came, maybe my cousin, my Auntie Laura's daughter, who got away to London, because they all got on the road in 1940 when the Germans first invaded Belgium. And it was full, teeming of refugees, you see in the films, you know. And my father was 20 years old. He didn't want to stay on the road with all these people, you know, and children. And so he said he would cut across the fields and get to the coast and get a boat to go down south so that he could prepare something for them when they arrived. So they gave him the Friday night candlesticks that he put in the rucksack, and off he went. And he went into he got into a very, you can imagine, 1940 terrible journey, but he came into this courtyard in Lille, just above, across the border, and he saw this courtyard, and he went into this courtyard, and he saw this bicycle up against a wall, and he swapped the candlesticks for the bicycle. So he let and then he could go. And then he hung on to the back of a British jeep for some miles, and he finally did get to the coast.
And did he told you that story?
He did himself. Yes, he did.
Did it take him a while before he could speak about it, or how did that conversation arise? That
story we heard quite early on, because it was the story of how he came to be in London.
Okay.
And he arrived, he got on this boat, and as soon as he knew it was going to England, which was moments after getting on the boat, he tried to jump off the boat. He didn't want, what did England have to do with him? He didn't want to go to England. He barely knew anything about England. He wanted to go down. And thank goodness people held him back and saved his life, really. And he got to Dover, the WRVS, and the cup of tea, and the wonderful British welcome that Britain used to give at that time. And then they were all taken to the Alexandra Palace, where there were hundreds and hundreds of beds, and gradually they got filtered out into the community. And nobody knew where anybody was or anything like that. He didn't know till he got a letter from the Red Cross in 1945 to say where his mother was. He was drafted into the British Army, and he had to change his name because they said, you know, if we send you back into Europe, you know, we can't send you in with a name like Nussbaum. So he looked in the telephone directory under N, and he thought, I'll take Norman because they conquered Britain. so he became Sidney Norman. And this is what Primo Levi said. He said, Auschwitz is outside of us, but it is all around us in the air. The plague has died away, but the infection still lingers, and it would be foolish to deny it. Rejection of human solidarity, obtuse and cynical indifference to the suffering of others, abdication of the intellect and of moral sense to the principle of authority, and above all, at the root of everything, a sweeping tide of cowardice, a colossal cowardice, which masks itself as warring virtue, love of country and faith in an idea. the dangers of nationalism. It's another discussion, but I've thought a lot about the difference between patriotism and nationalism, because they're different things. You can be very proud of your country and where you come from, and their language and the culture and the literature, but this can very easily lead to nationalism unless you're careful, because nationalism is you're proud of what you're not. I ended here. I could have had walls and walls of concentration camp art. If you go to Yad Vashem, there are a lot of paintings. This is a man, David Olaire. He was a French-Polish. He was a Sonderkommando, which means he survived because he was put to work and he dragged bodies out of the gas chambers and took them to the ovens. Given that, he was an artist. He was the only Sonderkommando artist that survived the war that anybody knows of. And there were no no TV cameras, nothing. So these, the artists were the people who do have records. And this woman here, Doris Zinkhuisen, she worked for the Red Cross, and she was liberated by the British, and she was the first artist to enter Bergen-Belsen. I think she was there about 2 days after it was liberated, and so she painted what she saw. That's what she saw in Belsen. And this is interesting, what she calls human laundry. Survivors that they found, that they press-ganged these German nurses from a nearby military establishment to come and cleanse these people who were still just about alive, so that the Red Cross could take them into their own hospitals without risk of typhoid. But there's a lot, and if you look online, you want to know more about art, look particularly at Theresienstadt, where there were thousands of children, and there happened to be quite a few artists there, and they kept working with these children where and as they could, and a lot of these paintings still exist today. They're children's paintings from the camps.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about the art, actually.
Yes.
And of course it's a really direct record, isn't it?
Yes, they're
what people
reporters of their day.
Yeah.
Really. And that's, you can wander down many alleyways from here to explore it if you want to explore it more. But I think you could, if we all could tell the stories of our lives and our predecessors, we might understand each other a little better, even if we speak different languages. Or there are ways. And there are things to hope about. When you put a group of young children from 20 different races together, they'll play and they'll dance and they'll sing. So that's all we need to know, isn't it, really? Mm-hmm. What happens then? I mean, my brother has huge Hanukkah parties. Hanukkah is our festival in December, and he has a lot of business contacts from all over the world. And I've seen them there. There we are playing all kinds of music, Israeli music, Arabic music, and these children, a lot of Indian contacts he has, and some African. And the kids are just the joy.
I think it's an amazing exhibition, the way you've used one person's story to tell a universal story.
Thank you.
And not just about the Holocaust, but about humans, about what's going on now. I think it's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Oh, well, thank you
really
for being
grateful.
here. And unless you come and you see it, then it's nothing. So we need, thank you.